Red is a color famous for wacky and chaotic effects. While this does often translate to fun cards, it also often translates to bad cards. For every powerful red burn spell or creature, there's a card with an effect so head-scratchingly bad, you wonder how it ever got printed. So today, we're going to go over the absolute worst cards Red has to offer. And starting us off at number 10, we have Goblin Kites. This is an enchantment for 1 and 1 red. It is the ability where you can pay 1 red to give target creature you control with toughness 2 or less flying until end of turn, which, if you don't know, makes it so that you can't be blocked except by creatures with flying. At the end of turn, you flip a coin, and if you lose the flip, you have to sacrifice that creature. It's worth starting out this segment by pointing out that flying is a good ability, even better back in the day when creatures outside of white and blue got the ability even more rarely than they do today. Red in particular only really got to have flyers on their dragons, which were always very expensive. Recognizing this, Wizards decided they needed to kneecap Goblin Kites to stop it from being too powerful. Unfortunately, they went way overboard with giving this card downsides. The restriction to only creatures with toughness 2 or less isn't completely backbreaking, but it does limit the card's use cases a lot. Evasion is more useful on larger creatures, as it will allow them to do more damage, but Kites is only allowed to buff your small creatures. It doesn't technically care about their power, but there aren't that many creatures with high power and low toughness. Creatures that fit this bill are also usually easy to remove, and trying to buff up the power of a creature without buffing its toughness is putting all of your eggs into a very precarious basket. None of this really matters though, because of Kite's additional, completely unnecessary downside. 50% of the time, the Kites will suffer a tragic malfunction and cause the creature to crash, which is awful odds. It also puts a terrible tension into using the card. Sure, you can give a high-powered creature flying and smack for good damage, but those are also creatures you really don't want to sacrifice. The best use for this card is giving flying to a creature that's going to die soon anyway, like a ball lightning. But these kinds of cards are few and far between, and also usually have their own evasion anyway. However, this is a use case where Goblin Kites can kind of do something. It may be worse than just playing burn spells and more creatures in your deck, sure, but it's not completely useless, which saves it from being any higher up this list at the very least. And at number 9, we have Goblin Sappers. This is a 1/1 goblin with a mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It has abilities where you can pay 2 red and tap it to make it so that target creature you control can't be blocked this turn. At the end of combat, destroy that creature and Goblin Sappers. Also, you can pay 4 red and tap it to make a creature you control unblockable this turn, but you only destroy that creature at the end of combat. Sappers is what happens when Goblin Kite gives up on even pretending it's a playable card. Sappers is a worse kite in every way. It can't be used the turn you play it and costs more mana to activate. At least now you actually know what will happen to your creatures instead of it being left up to chance. Though knowing you'll always lose your creature isn't really much of a consultation. Sappers isn't quite done being awful though, because you can only use it once. Clearly, this was simply too game warping of an effect for Wizards to let players use it multiple times. You can pay 4 mana to at least keep the Sappers around, but keeping a bad creature in play isn't worth essentially giving up your entire turn. If you're using a creature worth attacking with, you probably spent a good amount of mana to get it out. Only getting to swing once with it is just too painful, especially since you probably had to take your whole turn off to activate Sappers because it cost 4 mana. The best use for this card is, once again, with cards like Ball Lightning, but in that case, it's just a worse Goblin Kites. A sentence that should never be said about any card ever. And at number 8, we have Orcish Captain. This is a 1/1 Orc Warrior for 1 red. It is ability where you can pay 1 mana to flip a coin. If you win the flip, target Orc creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. And if you lose the flip, it gets -0/-2 until end of turn instead. In the early days of the game, Wizards had a terrible obsession with giving red cards coin flip abilities, and Orcish Captain is the worst example of this trend. Captain's ability to buff your creatures is the only reason you'd be interested in it, but what the effects of the card will be is completely up to chance. Other coin flip cards like Goblin Kites or Crazed Firecat at least do something if you lose the flip. Losing the flip makes them a lot worse, sure, and is why the cards never saw play. But at least the cards did something when you lost the flip. Other cards that flip coins do something broken if you win the flip, but do nothing or do something bad if you lose it. Like Desperate Gambit or Stitch in Time, either doubling the damage one of your creatures would deal or giving you an extra turn. Orcish Captain has the highest downside of losing a flip and the lowest upside of any coin flipping card. Giving a creature 2 power for 1 mana is good, but losing 2 toughness is backbreaking, especially since it only works with orcs. There were 4 orcs in Fallen Empires the set Captain released in, including the Captain itself, Brassclaw Orcs, Orcish Spy, and Orcish Veteran. If you take a look at these cards, all of them have 2 toughness. -2 is enough to kill all of these creatures on its own. And unlike with the other 2 cards in this list that kill the creature after combat, this happens before the creature even deals damage. Every time you activate Captain, you're gambling on even getting to deal damage, which is the main point of attacking with a creature. The card works better as a hate piece against Orc Tribal than a payoff for the tribe, which tells you everything you need to know. And at number 7, we have Flailing Soldier. This is a 2/2 human soldier for 1 red mana, which is a suspiciously good stat line for a card on this list. It has 2 abilities, both of which can be activated by any player. The first allows a player to pay 1 to give soldier +1/+1 until end of turn, and the other lets the player pay 1 to give soldier -1/-1 until end of turn. One of the oldest jokes in Magic is that every single creature is bad because they all die to Doomblade. Flailing Soldier is one of the few creatures in the game that essentially just hands your opponent a Doomblade as soon as you cast it. They can easily pay 2 mana to remove your creature from the board, barely spending more mana than you did to completely blank your play. You can pump the soldier to counteract this, but unless you keep up mana every single turn for the rest of the game, eventually your opponent will be able to just remove the soldier by paying a bit of mana. This obviously makes Soldier weak in the late game, but you may be wondering if Flailing Soldier is a good early game threat. If they get through a few hits, does it really matter if they die right away? Unfortunately for the soldier, it never really worked out. In an aggro deck, you really want to be spending all your mana on your turns developing your board, or at least playing burn spells. This means that on turn 2, you'll be passing to an opponent with no mana up, allowing him to kill your soldier for free thanks to only having taken a measly 2 damage from the card. A trade still very much in their favor. If you kept your mana up to try to save your soldier, you'd only be falling further behind as they developed their board and you didn't. In the vast majority of board states, the fight over Flailing Soldier is only going to hurt you. To make all this even worse, Red had much better threats even at this time. Cards like Jackal Pup did a much better job at applying early pressure, making Flailing Soldier feel completely worthless in comparison. And at number 6, we have Ember Shot. This is an instant that deals 3 damage to any target and allows you to draw a card. The downside is this card's massive mana cost of 6 and 1 red. So for 7 mana, you get to cast a lightning bolt and cycle it for another card. While this can get you a juicy 2-for-1 in this instance, that's not really all that useful. Card advantage gets talked up a bunch in talks about Magic, for good reason. But never forget that cards like Night Whisper exist and are pretty mid. For only 2 mana, you can get card advantage if you wanted, as long as you're willing to pay some life. Tempo matters, and being a huge blowout on tempo is half the reason why cards like Flametongue Kavu are so good. Ember Shot costs as much mana as one of the most broken spells ever printed, and has the same impact on a game as a 1 mana burn spell. The only upside to speak of is drawing a single, solitary card from the top of your deck, which could be something terrible like another land, or another copy of Ember Shot. You can even do things like cast Archmage Emeritus, then cast an actually good burn spell to build your own Ember Shot for less mana. And this will transform all of your burns into better Ember Shots at the same time. The cards that make Shot look the worst are the other options for 7 mana spells, however. Even the classic Shivan Dragon, a card that was never game warping or broken, is a far better use of your mana. It does way more damage and can basically give you card advantage by invalidating small creatures from your opponent. Funnily enough, the designers have said that Ember Shot came from an experiment to see how bad they can make a burn spell before it stopped being playable and limited. It seems that they learned something from this experiment because we haven't seen any burn spells quite this bad in decades. And at number 5, we have Melting. This is an enchantment for 3 and 1 red. It has the effect where all lands are no longer snow. For the uninitiated, snow is a super type that any card in the game can have, but it's most impactful on lands. Lands and other snow permanents that make mana will make snow mana, which can be used to pay snow costs. For example, Scrying Cheats requires snow mana to use its activated ability. However, the ability to make snow mana is tied to being a snow permanent, so with Melting on the field, you can turn off all of your opponent's snow synergies. Essentially, Melting is a mechanic hoser card for snow decks. The playability of hosers is always tied to how good the mechanic they turn off is, and unfortunately, snow, barring one card we'll cover in a bit, is not particularly powerful. The vast majority of snow cards weren't even good enough for standard, so playing a card to turn off snow lands was pretty weak. Not to mention that there just aren't that many cards that require snow to cast. Most snow synergy cards just want snow permanents around. If your opponent is playing a card like Frostbite, playing Melting will make it worse, but it won't blink the card or anything. Even the cards that do need snow mana, like Faceless Haven, isn't completely blown up by Melting because the card was already fine as a land. The philosophy of snow card that's fine alone but better with snow was made as a direct response to initial wave of snow cards being so weak, so most modern day snow cards won't get punished by Melting. This even includes the few snow cards Melting would theoretically be good against, like Arcum's Astrolabe. Astrolabe is an incredibly powerful card that fixes your mana for the rest of the game for a single snow mana. If you have a Melting on board, then your opponent won't be able to make the snow mana for Astrolabe. Unfortunately, Astrolabe is a 1 mana card, so it will resolve far before Melting ever does. And then your opponent can cast future Astrolabes with the mana the first one produces because it's also a snow card. What this means is that Melting is too expensive to even effectively hose the cards it could theoretically do something against. Melting might have been playable if there were a snow version of Blood Moon or Back to Basics. The card could have at least done its job at punishing a niche mechanic, but instead Melting may as well only have flavor text. And at number 4, we have Oath of Mages. This is an enchantment with the mana cost of 1 and 1 red. It is the ability where, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player chooses one of their opponents who has more life than them. Then Oath of Mages deals 1 damage to that player. This is a member of the same cycles of Oath of Druids, which has consistently been used in combo decks and Vintage to cheat out game-ending threats. So obviously what red needed from this cycle was a downgraded copper tablet. Not only does this card do minimal damage, and not only is it symmetrical, but it also doesn't even always work. In fact, it can't burn your opponent for the critical final points of damage, because that would require you to be at 0 life, which obviously represents some issues. Unlike most of the cards in this list, there aren't even any hypothetical applications of the card. Ember Shot could be good if you had a ton of Goblin Electromancers on the field to make it castable. The no blocking cards can theoretically let you push through for lethal in a pinch. However, Oath of Mages never really does anything worthwhile. Even if you stack a ton of cards like Torbrand, Thane of Red Fell to make it deal more damage, it will still be doing too little damage to let you win before your opponent takes over the game. It's probably worth looking at Roiling Vortex for comparison. For the same amount of mana, Vortex always deals the damage, deals 5 damage to any player if they cast a spell for no mana, and lets you pay 1 red to stop your opponent from gaining life until end of turn. Even with all of these extra upsides, Vortex was a sideboard card, and mostly used for the other abilities the card had. Oath of Mages is so away from being playable, it probably doesn't even know what a card sleeve is. And at number 3, we have Kumano's Blessing. This is an enchantment ore with a mana cost of 2 and 1 red. It has enchant creature and flash, meaning you can cast it at any time you could cast an instant. Finally, it has the effect where if a creature dealt damage by enchanted creature this turn would die, you exile it instead. And the award for most narrow piece of hate ever designed goes to whatever this is supposed to be. Graveyard Hate is a good effect, and Graveyard Hate that stops death triggers is an even higher premium. Unfortunately, Kumano's Blessing is difficult to make work and not very impactful. Red has a few cards that work this way, cards that exile whatever they deal damage to if they would die. Of course, there are usually burn spells that function as removal on their own. Blessing only adds its effect onto other creatures, so you need to be in a situation where one of your creatures is already killing one of your opponent's creatures in combat, and you need to want that creature to get exiled. At that point, why not just use colorless options like Tormod's Crypt to get rid of the threat? This isn't even mentioning how easily you can get blown out, because all auras are inherently suspect thanks to getting blown out by removal. All this on top of asking for 3 mana for this garbage effect. Blessing is a waste of mana and a card, but at least it isn't actively helping your opponent, which can't be said for the last 2 cards on this list. And at number 2, we have Tahngarth's Glare. This is a sorcery for 1 red. It has the effect where you look at the top 3 cards of target opponent's deck, then put them back in any order. Then that player does the same to your library. So what you do is put all of the worst cards back on top of your opponent's deck so they draw them first. Then they place another Glare on top of your deck so you drew even more garbage. Overall, this will be worse off for you because you're the one who went down a card to do it. Of course, like any symmetrical effect, there are ways to break the symmetry. If you have cards like Codex Shredder in play, you can mill particularly good draws off of your opponent's library right before they draw them. The issue is that this isn't a good strategy. You need to draw more Fate Seal effects in order to continue to lock your opponent's draws, which isn't exactly a common effect, especially not in red. And of course, you'll be less likely to draw those cards on time because your opponent will be messing with the top cards of your deck as well. There have been times where this strategy has worked, but that was done by abusing Lantern of Insight, which constantly lets you monitor the top card of your opponent's deck. A one-time check of the top cards of your opponent's deck will mess with their draw, but eventually they'll draw enough cards and find their actual action. You'll end up losing out overall because you'll be down so many cards, and often be worse off on board as a result. You need to be putting pressure on them at the same time, which you can't do if you're trying to play cards to break Glare symmetry. Glare just asks for too much. It needs cards to synergize with, needs you to be ahead on board, and needs you to be okay with top decking garbage for a few turns. No deck will realistically be in this situation in any game. And at number 1, we have Break Open. This is an instant for 1/1 red. It is the effect where you turn target face down creature and opponent controls face up. Now, this card only does anything against the morph mechanic, which allows you to pay 3 mana to cast a creature as a face down 2/2, then pay a cost to flip it face up. It's very important to note that this says target creature and opponent controls, because otherwise the card might actually be useful. Now, the way most morph cards are designed is that they either have huge stats, and you can use them for cheaper by morphing them, or have powerful abilities when they're turned face up. Both of these are circumstances where turning the creature face up is a good thing for your opponent, so you can probably see why Break Open is a bad card. You are doing something that your opponent was probably going to pay mana to do later, and going down a card to do so. Now, there are situations where this isn't completely awful. Some morph cards, like Good Ol' Lurker, do shrink when morphed, and some morph creatures like Willbender need to be flipped at a particular time to get value. However, if you're trying to punish these cards, there are far better options. Using a card like Pyroclasm to wipe all their morph creatures if you don't have small creatures, or just waiting for your opponent to tap out and using a bolt is far more practical. And remember, these are situations where your opponent has one of a few specific morph cards that's good to flip face up. Most of the time, playing and casting Break Open is actively lowering your chances of winning the game, and there aren't even ways to make the card useful. Break Open is one of the few cards in Magic that consistently helps your opponent without there being some sort of hidden synergy. The card feels less like a part of a deck strategy, and more like a practical joke from Wizards. Alright, and there's the video. Are there any other cards you think I may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, let us know down in the comments below.